Welcome, everyone. Great to have you here. We're excited to have you for this webinar featuring experts from the University of Oregon to talk about the 2024 election. I'm Seth Lewis. I'm the Shirley Papé Chair in Emerging Media in the School of Journalism and Communication, and I'm a former journalist and have studied the changing nature of news and technology, including around questions of politics and public affairs. Our forum today is going to focus on a range of questions related to the 2024 election, including what it means to be presidential, to what polls suggest is happening, to how the press is covering conspiracy theories and polarization, in addition to issues such as abortion and AI. I'll ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their expertise, and then I'll proceed with some questions for each of our panelists. So let's begin, Neil, and then Chandler, Whitney, and then Allison.
Hey everyone, my name is Neil O'Brien. I'm an assistant professor here in the political science department at UO, and I study U.S. politics fairly broadly, focusing largely on polarization, both in institutions and public opinion. And my more recent work has focused on trust and attitudes around healthcare.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Chandler James. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department, and I research the U.S. presidency, American politics, and public opinion. And my research concerns presidential norms, what constitutes appropriate presidential behavior, and how the public thinks about what the president ought to be.
Hi, everybody. My name is Whitney Phillips. I'm an assistant professor of digital platforms and media ethics in the School of Journalism and Communication here at UO. And I look at the intersections of politics, media, and religion, or quasi-religion, as the case may be, and do a lot of work focusing on elections and just the general complexity and often strangeness of our political landscape currently.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Gash. I'm professor of political science and chair of the department. My research tends to focus on law and social policy with a specific focus on reproductive choice and LGBTQ rights. And I have a special interest in how LGBTQ rights get activated as a wedge issue when abortion politics start to fail.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Just to, again, by way of process, we'll ask each of the panelists a main question, and then we'll kind of move around the panel that way. And after that, we'll open the floor to your questions. And the chat is open anytime as well if you want to drop in a question there that we can answer during the second half of the forum. So we'll start with Neil. It's kind of a set of questions here, Neil, just looking at the state of the race. I wonder if you could start by painting a picture for us about where we stand nationally as well as regionally in terms of the presidency and also congressional races. So, for example, looking at the congressional district races, where do the polls stand now, and what do you think are some of the factors that could shake up the polls at this stage of the race?
Yeah, it's as you know, it's a very competitive race. Averages have Harris up by about 3 points nationally, of course, and this lesson was learned especially well in 2016 and 2020. It's not a national race. Question is, are you going to carry enough of the swing states for a candidate to put them over the edge? The same answer goes there for those swingy states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then in the South, Sun Belt, they're often called, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, recently North Carolina seems like it's in play. It's a very, very close race. And I think the question that's on a lot of folks' mind is, are these polls going to be right, or is there going to be a bias in them? And as we saw in 16 and 20, those biases across states are probably pretty correlated. So miss in one state is probably going to be correlated potentially with misses in other states. At the congressional level, the answer is the same. And this has been characteristic of the last few cycles. The number of swingy districts are very few. The Cook Political Report this morning had just 25 seats, as they're calling, as toss-ups. And the question is, who's going to walk away with those? In 2022, also very few toss-ups, and Democrats seem to pick them up in a pretty overwhelming manner, making the election, or at least in terms of the seat change, to be much more competitive than people initially thought. But it's going to be very close, and not entirely satisfying answer, but it's really wait and see what happens.
Great, thanks, Neil. I think one of the questions that is on people's minds as well is this. This is a question for Chandler. Thinking about the factors that are shaping vote choice in elections. I mean, there's a number of factors from incumbency to money donations, advertising, et cetera. I mean, and one of those questions could be questions about what it means to be presidential or what is expected of someone to be seen fit for the presidency. I wonder if you might talk just a bit about some of the dynamics you've seen over the course of this election cycle when it comes to the various factors that shape vote choice.
So the US presidency is defined by Article 2 of the Constitution, statutory law, case law, things like that. But it's also defined by what we would call presidential norms. So these are kind of expectations or traditions or patterned behavior that we come to expect of the presidency. And one of the most significant norms of the US presidency, and I think that many would probably lament this, is that there has never been a woman or female identifying president. And this is a barrier, a glass barrier that Hillary Clinton attempted to break, but faltered in her attempt in 2016, and Kamala will seek to break in November. And so Kamala Harris's campaign, I think, is largely centered around number one, kind of ginning up support for her candidacy, particularly among young women and women in general, but also demonstrating to people who are skeptical that she has the characteristics necessary to perform the presidency well. On the other hand, with former President Trump, he emerged onto the political scene in 2015, 2016 as a populist firebrand who was perfectly willing to break norms, to push boundaries, to try new things in order to succeed in politics. And I think that this is a fundamental part of his brand. So in many respects, we can think of Trump as a norm violator, presidential norm violator. And that was made manifest through many of his actions as president. And I think that it's telling in 2020, this became a central component of the campaign where Biden tried to pose himself as a return to normalcy. Now, in 2024, Trump has been out of office for 4 years now. Harris is taking on the mantle of the Biden administration, and she's also trying to characterize Trump as unfit for the office, as someone who is temperamentally unsound and as someone who would totally tarnish democratic norms and traditions if elected again. Now, I think the central question is whether this will be a appealing pitch to the voters. So Neil and I have done some research earlier in the year and found that for young voters, centralizing Trump's norm violations was not very moving, at least in terms of getting young voters to support Biden. And I think that we can see this in many respects in the Harris messaging. Although Trump's threat to democracy has factored centrally into the campaign, it's not the foremost issue. And instead, she has presented herself as a defender of freedom, which I think is taking on some of the mantle of Republicans who have traditionally gravitated around that mantra, but also packaging it in defense of abortion rights, which is, I think, probably one of the central policy issues of the campaign. And we see this playing out now with Melania Trump's comments, but as well as the VP debate, where we saw J.D. Vance take a more moderate tack on abortion, trying to stymie some of the momentum that Harris has gained from using this issue as a leading part of her campaign. And so I think that when we look back on this election, we will definitely reflect on how Harris's identity as a woman and Trump's identity as a norm violator shaped the election.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you, Chandler. I think you've given us a lot of things we could come back to later on to explore further, for sure. Let's go to you, Whitney, next, and talk about what you feel like is perhaps being missed in media coverage. There's been talk of conspiracy theories. Obviously, political polarization has been a key theme for a number of years now. Questions about religious influence maybe haven't received the sort of attention that they have in previous cycles, or it's come and gone. I wonder if you might just talk about, just in general, what you've seen in terms of patterns of coverage and, perhaps good things as well as missed opportunities.
Yeah, that's a good and very complicated question. So there are three areas that I have been looking at pretty closely over the last few years, corresponding to a book that I'm just now finishing, doing all of the edits on the proofs as we speak. And that book looks at the influence of religion without religion, so religious rhetoric and symbology that is not actually connected necessarily to theological stricture. And thinking about how that has really influenced politics in a way that maybe is not always captured in the traditional account. And that research has pushed me into three different directions that I look for when I'm engaging with or thinking about news coverage of the election in particular. And one is the tendency for, and I'm speaking about reporters primarily, but also, as you see often unfolding in social media commentary, so public discourse, how religion, and especially Christianity, when people see the language of religion, the assumption is that it is religious. And you see this in particular when people have affixed labels like white Christian nationalism onto things like Project 2025 and and also, of course, evangelical support for Trump, that term gets used a lot to describe a sort of anti-democratic kind of move within certain religious networks, at least presumably religious networks. And the problem that I see with a lot of those, with that discourse, is that many of the things that are actually described as religious or attributed, again, to white Christian nationalism are coming from secular sources, or are actually secular in nature, or are not actually advocating for biblical principle instantiated in US law, that it isn't actually about theocracy, it's about something else. And I think that something else is really important to reflect on, and isn't always in the coverage or in the conversation that exists around white Christian nationalism. Similarly, to kind of piggyback on using scare quotes to describe something that is taken for granted, oftentimes when people talk about polarization, or maybe they're not saying the word polarization specifically, but they're talking about why we're so hopelessly split, that there is a taking for granted that we are all in agreement with, and that there is consistency over time in the idea of liberal and conservative, left versus right. And in particular, liberals, so doing some of this historical work that brought us all the way back to the Cold War, you can actually see that the division between left and right is a lot squishier and a lot stranger than the sort of traditional polarization frame often accounts for. And again, I'm talking about public discourse, the way that people talk about this in a colloquial way. But the assumption is that liberalism refers to something really specific, and that it cleanly maps onto the left and Democrats, and those terms often get used interchangeably. I mean, you certainly hear this with Trump always talking about, Kamala Harris as being not only a socialist or Comrade Kamala, but, a radical leftist liberal. And historically, those are weird things that to go together. And yet we very often sort of base our political identities off of the presumption of this very, very clear cleaving that I think could be challenged more directly. I mean, I saw this most recently in the sort of the story about Blue Anon. So the fact that you were seeing, conspiracy theories emerging on what was described as the left about the assassination attempts of Trump. But in that coverage, it wasn't exactly clear, what does the left mean? Like it's hard, it's taken for granted as if it's totally clear, totally straightforward. But actually, I think that it's not. I think that could be challenged. And the idea that you would have Blue Anon versus QAnon, it's catchy, But I think we need to think a little bit more carefully about how it is that we're articulating the binaries, because those binaries play a big role in how we conceptualize ourselves in relation to each other. And then the third thing that has emerged, especially from the historical work that I've done, is looking at when there is a conspiracy theory that is, making enormous headlines, like the cat eating, the Haitians eating cats, the false claims about that. The focus is often on the conspiracy theory itself, or the outrageousness of the claim, because it is so beyond the pale, it needs pushing back against, it's false. And it's important to do that. But at the same time, there's often a lot of deeper, much more mainstream institutional attitudes about, for example, liberal policies. Again, there's that scare quotes again, that result in the presence of groups of people, in this case Haitian migrants, that are looked upon by certain, particularly within the right-wing conservative media ecosystem, as being suspect and dangerous and threatening to the United States. And those are not conspiratorial claims exactly. It's a sort of a deeper attitude, a more widespread attitude about the danger of liberalism, right? And that gets kind of obscured. The mainstream element of that, the pervasiveness of that belief, gets obscured when we focus on just the really extreme articulations of conspiracy theories, which doesn't mean that those shouldn't be touched on. But there's just a lot beneath the surface that you don't often see, or that you see less of in coverage, that I really think also needs foregrounding.
Great. Thanks, Whitney. I think you touched on, again, a lot of good things that we can come back to later on, including around like shifting coalitions and, what polarization means in a world where some of these terms about left and right and so forth may not have the meaning that they might have once had. Allison, if we can go to you with a question about reproductive choice and how this is playing, this obviously a very central issue, how it's playing out in the election, and sort of more broadly, what you see as the relationship between reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights, and maybe just the place of so-called woke politics in this contentious election. And I think obviously this ties in with things like Project 2025 and a number of other things that have been hot button issues this cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So a lot of my research recently has focused in particular on how conservative politics, obviously is always about catalyzing the base and adding to the base. And the ways in which conservative politics has generally done this is by activating fears, and in particular activating fears about the welfare of children, right? So I've published a couple different manuscripts about this particular issue, and I think that we're seeing this play out in 2024, in particular through Project 2025. And so what's really interesting about the role of reproductive choice and reproductive rights in this story is that, the sort of tried and true traditional policy arena for conservatives to focus on in terms of catalyzing their base has always been about striking down Roe v. Wade. This was a big way in which the Christian Coalition got its start. And so they've been able to rely on, activating those fears about, what it means to have legal abortions in the United States, what that means for children's welfare, what that means for fetal rights, etc. And so the dismantling of Roe v. Wade, in a way, creates a conundrum for conservatives, because there's not a lot for them to catalyze around. They've sort of achieved the thing they wanted to achieve, but also in achieving it, it's become a mixed blessing, right? It turns out that there were a lot of individuals, in particular in the Republican Party, also among independents, who actually, when push came to shove and states started to ban abortion, in the post dismantling of Roe v. Wade era, it turns out that they didn't actually want that. That not only did they not want such serious constraints on abortion access, but they also didn't want the spillover effects that we see happening, right? The problems for pregnant individuals who are experiencing medical trauma, and now can't get access to the typical kinds of remedies that they might be able to seek, because physicians are worried about the bans on abortion and how they'll play out, right, in terms of other medical access. And, of course, the Harris administration, or the Harris campaign, is doing a really great job of playing on that, right, of highlighting exactly the sort of extent to which bans on abortion have now created serious problems for pregnant women who want to keep their pregnancies, but for whatever reason can't keep their pregnancies because of medical distress. And so this is creating a really interesting coalition of individuals who perhaps prior to this wouldn't have necessarily been necessarily pro-choice or actively pro-choice, but are now realizing that in a post-Roe v. Wade world, in a post-dismantling of Roe v. Wade world, there are whole sorts of ways in which their lives are impacted. And so we can think about pregnant women, women who want to become pregnant, the husbands, right, and the fathers of women who are pregnant, and then also parents who have daughters, right, who are now worried about what the future might look like for them as they endeavor to get pregnant and face a whole range of medical challenges. It's also creating, interestingly, an access problem for people who just want basic prenatal care, because now we're seeing, right, a sort of loss of physicians who want to practice, who want to be OBGYNs in states where there are these bans on abortion, because of course, right, that practice is challenged by these problematic laws, right, in terms of their autonomy, their medical autonomy. So the reproductive choice pro-life movement is sort of in a bit of a fix at the moment. And so traditionally what conservatives have done is they've pivoted, right, to the next space when they realize that the pro-life movement isn't as activating as perhaps it may want to be. And usually that next space is LGBTQ rights. So we saw this in the late 80s, early 90s, when the pro-choice or when the pro-life movement was starting to wane. We saw conservatives moving into, and in fact predicting, a fight on the part of the left to pursue marriage equality. In fact, it was actually conservatives who sort of set that agenda, right? They said, even though there was absolutely no evidence of this thing happening, but they said that folks on the left were pursuing marriage equality. They weren't at the time, but they built this whole scaffolding, this whole apparatus around dismantling the possibility of marriage equality for gay and lesbian couples. And so by the time marriage equality actually became a thing that the left was interested in pursuing, conservatives had already had this very strong movement afoot, and very quickly passed the Defense of Marriage Act, and very quickly moved on in the late 90s and early 2000s to ban marriage equality at the state level, which had a windfall of electoral benefits for a bunch of different political races, and then obviously for the ballot measures themselves. And so I think the version of that we're seeing now in 2024 is obviously things having to do with gender identity, right? So, right, we see Trump, we see Trump surrogates, we see Vance referencing gender identity, referencing gender identity in the context of sports, in the context of access to healthcare, right? The idea that students can go to school and suddenly find themselves in a situation where they're having surgeries at school to change their gender identity, right? A whole sense of really hyperbolic claims about gender identity are being raised because this is a winning strategy in terms of that overall more general strategy about catalyzing fear about the welfare of children. And so I think now that we see the pro-life playbook not playing out as well as it has in the past, right, we're again seeing conservatives borrowing from the LGBTQ playbook and shifting into those spaces. And then, right, the sort of general idea of woke politics, right, banning books around race and racial justice, banning books that reference sexual orientation or gender identity, or sort of provide an open space for those discussions, right? Those are all sort of geared towards activating that base and expanding that base in the same way that the pro-life movement had done before.
Great. Thanks, Allison. Well, again, there's lots of great and really good entry points for us to explore in the conversation. Just to remind you, you can drop questions, comments in the chat that we can follow up with in the course of our discussion today. Maybe we could start with this, and then this is not, this is for the whole panel here, so you all can chime in and however you like. I think we can see many ways in which this has been a very unique type of election season. We've had attempted assassination. There's been a change in the candidate for the Democratic Party. I mean, there's a lot of things that are certainly outside of the norm, but yet also probably lots of ways in which this tracks with previous election cycles and in other ways too. So I wonder if our panelists might touch on this question of like, what do you find really different or unique or really interesting, perhaps something we haven't discussed yet so far, that really stands out to you as kind of being one of the defining trends or developments in this 24 election season?
I'll get us started. I think that Trump really proved that there was a lot of innovation to be had in presidential politics, and he gained advances in spaces and areas in 2016, 2020 that I think were people were less attuned to. And so it's because of these norms and general practices that people kind of get swept up in the continuity of things, right? But there's always room for new approaches, and there are opportunity costs for just doing the same playbook. And I think that what is fascinating to me about the 2024 election is the replacement of Biden with Harris a couple of weeks before the Democratic National Convention. And it totally overturned or changed the dynamics of the race. And Biden was really struggling with young voters and really on a trajectory to lose particularly after his debate performance. And he was losing support not only among the public, but also among Democratic officials. And then Harris comes in, and not only does she seize the moment, right, and kind of take the nomination, clear out all potential opponents, but also delivers a terrific convention and debate performance, such that she's well positioned to win in 2024, and in much better position than Biden was. And what's striking to me about that is, like, her in 2020, she struggled to get off the ground, her campaign off the ground. And what it says to me, or it suggests to me, is that there is a lot of room for innovation in presidential politics strategy or campaign strategy, because the Trump campaign has really found it difficult to readjust their campaign for Harris. Their entire strategy revolved around defeating Biden, and the same thing with Biden toward Trump. But with the introduction of Harris into the campaign, it left in many respects the Trump campaign flat-footed. They were surging with momentum after Trump's assassination attempt and the Republican National Convention. But then I think the change dynamics have suggested that when in kind of context of strategy like that, changing course, making very abrupt or significant changes can really change the dynamics of the race and allow for new possibilities, new opportunities that I think future campaigns will consider as they find themselves in hazardous waters in the lead up to the election.
Great, thanks, Chandler. And I think just even the question of the timing, right? She seems to have benefited from a compressed cycle, and that may have some interesting implications for future of election seasons in terms of their timing. Whitney?
Yeah, it's to the point of the sort of new opportunities. I mean, so for me, when I think about what's the most interesting thing about this cycle, or what's new and different about it, is the absolute cannibalization of the Republican Party by the Republican Party. And the way that, and I'll sort of unpack that in a second, but the way that points to the need for new coalitions, for understanding new ways of sort of, where do people fit? I mean, so you see during this cycle, people so let me back up a second. So in this book project, one of the things we're theorizing is what we call anti-liberal demonology, which is it doesn't necessarily look like religion. It doesn't necessarily say the words God or Jesus or anything like that, but there's almost religious fervor in conservative antipathy towards liberals. But this liberalism is often really vague, and it's not all conservatives. It's a particular kind of demonologically focused conservatism that is mostly focused on fighting the liberal devil. But the liberal devil is very poorly defined. It's amorphous. It's kind of a placeholder. And the way that you see this playing out in the current cycle is that you have very conservative people. You have Mitt Romney, you have Liz Cheney, you have Dick Cheney, you have George Bush, you have all these people who are as conservative as you can get, who have been absolutely purged from the acceptable limits of what it means to be a Republican. I mean, you hear kinds of wild things on social media about George Bush is a liberal failure. And I mean, it wasn't that long ago, and that would have been an absolutely outrageous thing to hear. And even, Trump's attacks against Dick Cheney as a rhino because he's not voting for Trump. I mean, there's very weird things, sort of cross-partisan weirdnesses happening within the Republican Party right now. And it points to the fact that that division between left and right doesn't quite capture what we're sort of seeing, where the Republican Party, institutional Republican Party, doesn't have space for anyone that gets either declared a liberal or gets associated as being sympathetic to liberals in the sense of, and we talk about it, a liberal is designated within this sort of worldview and framework as anybody who is threatening to the family, to conservatism, to Christianity, and to God. But that can shift, and that can subsume all kinds of people, including a lot of Republicans and including a lot of Christians. So it's very, very weird. So you have all these people who are actually stalwart Republican conservatives who get put into the sort of liberal devil category. And it highlights the fact that what we really need to do, rather than focusing on where left and right has previously been drawn, which isn't doing a very good job of sort of helping us understand MAGA, is thinking about, well, what line really does divide our politics? What is the thing that we can actually point to that helps us explain how you have a coalition of, Dick Cheney and also Bernie Sanders? And that is the line between minoritarianism, the imposition of sort of narrow experiences, beliefs, norms, whatever, onto the rest of the country, and pluralism, which seeks to create space for a variety, for a whole range of positions, of experiences, beliefs, norms, all of that. And so I think that the fact that the Republican Party is doing such weird things right now to other Republicans in particular, that helps us. I think that highlights how do we look at our lines differently, or how can we think more, not creatively, but more accurately about what's actually going on with the coalitions that are naturally forming, that just don't line up with how we would have necessarily thought things to line up even just 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, indeed. I want to definitely come back to this question of shifting coalitions, and I think there's so much interesting things to explore there. First, though, Neil or Allison, you don't need to, but if you had anything you wanted to chime in on that, feel free to do so. And also, let me mention too, to those who are watching, I think the chat may have been disabled originally. Settings are now changed, so if you tried earlier, please try again and drop your question in the chat or for a Q&A, so we can bring that up. Allison or Neil, we can move on. Okay. So maybe next question then is, we've got about, I think, exactly a month. There's people talk about the October surprise, and obviously things are happening in the Middle East, unfortunately, that are creating a lot of potential difficulties in terms of foreign policy, international relations. I mean, there's other types of things, whether with the economy or who knows, right, that could pop up and become a significant issue. I wonder what you see as a panel as some of the things that could present themselves over the next month that would or wouldn't change the dynamics of the race. I mean, I think one of the questions is are we just locked in now, and it's going to be going down to the wire, to what looks like to be a very razor thin margin one way or the other? Or do you see the potential for some type of thing that could really open up the race at this point?
I'll get us started on that. I mean, I think the reality is that at this point, the ways in which elections are run, the fact that basically it's just a social media race. I think there's going to be lots of things that shock, the election in various ways, be they stories or exogenous things, right? The strike that was looming that has now been averted was one of those things that I think could have been really impactful on the election. But I think we're operating on a 1 week cycle at this point in terms of the capacity for these things to actually have stickiness in terms of people's thoughts. And I also think that though there are supposedly undecided voters out there, I think for the most part people have made up their mind. And I think at this point it's just a matter of voter turnout, right? I think the issue mostly at this point is who's going to decide to get up, and go, or who's going to decide to early vote, or what sorts of things are going to happen in that regard. And in that way, the thing that I worry about the most, and this is not necessarily an October surprise issue so much as a thing that is still looming and yet unknown, is what is the process, right? What is the voting process going to look like this year? What is access to polls going to look like this year? What is the counting of votes going to look like this year? What kind of threats are we going to see in terms of election officials, right? And the folks that volunteer to be available at the polls or to count the votes or whatnot. Those are the things that I think at this point in the election are going to be most impactful, is really those procedural pieces that are just really unknown at this point.
I wonder if just to build on that is, I think Hillary Clinton said this week, there's going to be some October surprise. I don't know what it is, but it's going to happen. And I think Allison is absolutely right that it's not going to move a huge chunk of voters. But these races are so close. And so even a little bit here or there, it's not going to transform the electorate, but is it going to keep a few folks, actually, is it going to keep folks on one side home and propel turnout on the other side? There are some undecided voters out there, which is, I think, a perpetual question of who are those folks? Maybe it'll move folks around a little bit. One thing is, and I think Chandler, you hit on this, of what was really remarkable about this election was Biden stepping down and Harris taking over. And there was, I think it was a net of 6 points in about a month in terms of Harris growing on Biden. And I was very surprised by that, because one view is we are so polarized that you take out Biden and put in Harris, they're going to poll about the same. And that clearly didn't happen. And so I do think maybe less about this election, but as scholars and commentators on the political process of thinking about the quickness of that change in such a short period of time, and what it says about our polarization. But I think absolutely right now, things are locked in so many ways. Something's going to happen, and it could affect the election, but I would agree with Allison. It's not going to be a big transformation. It could be at the margins, but that elections are decided at the margins, and that's my guess is that's what's going to tilt it one way or the other.
So people crave consistency and predictability. And I think that as pundits, many people like to, prognosticate about what they think will happen. And this is a part of the human experience. However, just the recent past couple months prove that there's so much that could happen that we have no idea. In the last 6 months, Biden has stepped down from his campaign. He stepped aside. He's put Kamala Harris first. Trump has experienced 2 assassination attempts. One that was a couple of millimeters away from his head that would have killed him. There are credible reports that Iran is seeking to assassinate Trump. There is war going on in Lebanon and Gaza and Israel, Ukraine, Russia. We have no idea what's going to happen. We really don't. And there's so much that could happen in the next month. And I think that it's important to recognize that although we have this kind of sense of predictability and pattern behavior, in many respects, there's so much that we don't know. There's so many factors that could intrude upon our politics and fundamentally alter the structure on which we kind of conceive of our political system. I mean, just think about it. Like, we have J.D. Vance, who was an avowed anti-abortion person, going on national TV in front of 43 million people and saying the Republican Party needs to do better on this issue. We see lots of Black people, African Americans, kind of curious about the Republican Party and Trump. So I think that there's a lot that I think that my colleagues are right in the sense that in most likely nothing will fundamentally alter the race in the next month. But there's always a chance that something truly dramatic can happen. And it seems to me like more and more of these types of events are unfolding day and day.
Yeah, thanks, Chandler. Thanks, everybody. Those are great. I think you touched on something just now that was come up a few times in our conversation, and that's relates to these shifting coalitions or shifting dynamics. Republicans having, at least it seems, a bit more success with minority groups than they've had in the past. You have Democrats, who used to be the party of the working class, clearly seeing a pretty vast erosion of that strength. And meanwhile, there's been kind of this shift among college graduates toward the Democratic Party in a pretty significant way. And so I wonder if you might talk about what are some of the, I don't know, larger forces or factors here in play, perhaps even ones that aren't getting the coverage they deserve, that might be shaping what we are seeing in terms of these shifting coalitions and what it says about, it could be about the future of these parties or simply about the nature of party politics. And we might just note, I think parenthetically, that it's fascinating that no matter how much these coalitions shift and change, we still seem to be at about 50-50 or 45-45 with a few undecideds in the middle, which is itself kind of an interesting feature. So I don't know if any of you want to jump in on that question of what do you think, what's going on here? What might, and are there certain factors related to these shifting coalitions that perhaps need further investigation or exploration?
Well, I think one thing that you could say, and this has been reported on and studied to some length, is, as you suggest, there's this political scientists call it the diploma divide or education polarization, where even going back to 2012, whether you hold a college degree or not isn't terribly predictive of who you vote for. And in 1620 and by all measures 24, college, whether you have a college degree or not, is a very salient cleavage at the electoral level. Why is that? In some ways, it's a maturation of strategies that have been building on each other since, I would argue, since the 1960s, where if you can think of politics as one dimension being over economic issues and then another dimension being over social issues meaning race, immigration, LGBTQ rights, abortion, and so on. As that social dimension gained salience, and as, for example, Trump staked out very conservative positions on immigration or on transgender rights, folks with lower levels of formal education tend to be more conservative on those issues. And although maybe would vote for the Democratic Party based on economic issues alone, as that other cleavage is brought into politics, are able to be picked off. And as Allison, it's a wedge strategy for the right to pick up some votes in that way. And so thinking about what's driving that transformation, it's just and these issues have been in our politics for decades, but it does seem like immigration, for example, it's just really heated up, and it's just so central to contemporary party conflict in a way that it wasn't even 15 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Allison?
Yeah, I would say, there's coalition shifting and then there's coalition dismantling. And I think that we're in a period where both of those things are happening. I don't think we really truly have a good sense yet of what U.S. support for Israel has done to the left in terms of the coalitions that have been the stronghold of the Democratic Party. I don't think we're going to know until we see who shows up to vote and how they vote in 2024. I mean, there's definitely predictions, but I don't think we really have a full sense yet of whether the U.S. support for Israel is going to have this sort of effect, significant effect on that, the glue that holds the Democratic Party together through these coalitions. Gen Z is another sort of giant question mark. What's really interesting about Gen Z is that they're just not as impressed with partisan politics. They're not as committed to the idea of partisan politics. They hold particular policy views, they have ideological preferences, but they're not as swayed by the sort of commitments that other voters, older voters have to party in particular. And so seeing how Gen Z shows up to vote this time relative to even 2 years ago, I think is just a big giant question mark as well. And I think, again, the war against Gaza and the US involvement in that war, I think is going to play out in interesting ways for that population in particular. And then there's that giant wedge issue of gender identity that I think is a really effective narrative or rhetorical space for conservatives to occupy. I think it does pull in a bunch of folks in the same way that pro-life narratives also pulled in a bunch of folks to the sort of conservative thinking on things. And I think at a local level, conservatives are doing a really good job, particularly, and this was their strategy, was on school boards, really manufacturing fear around these particular issues, catalyzing book bans and the like. And I think it's really worked in local communities. And so we have yet to see, we tend to focus as scholars on national elections, on these national polls, but really to a very large degree, and in connection to what Neil was saying, this is really, this election is really going to come down to what local communities decide to do and what local communities find most pressing. And I think Republicans have done a really great job of occupying those local, tiny community level spaces with a certain kind of politics and a certain kind of framework that I think we're going to see play out in the election.
Great, thanks, Allison. And speaking of this, Chandler, go ahead.
I want
Yeah, of course.
to touch on this because I think it's a great question. And you're asking, I think that you ended your question with, why do we see such parity between the two parties? They seem to why do we seem to always be 50-50? And I want to point us to this really phenomenal text from the mid-century by Anthony Downs called An Economic Theory of Democracy. And what Downs suggests is that party competition, the pursuit of obtaining what we would describe as the median voter. So if we can imagine all the voters on a unidimensional scale in terms of their policy preferences and say that there's a normal distribution, most of the voters are in the middle. Now, what makes this a difficult analysis, is that we can't really, as Whitney says, easily put people on a unidimensional scale from left to right. Politics, political conflict is multi-dimensional. But I think that Downs's point is salient here. That is to say that the parties, in their effort to win elections, are constantly changing their policy platforms, the way that they talk, their discourse, and their pursuits in order to obtain a majority of voters. And so in the VP debate, we saw hints of this with respect to the Republican Party. Now, many people say that Trump is this, extremely conservative Republican, but in many respects, what made him different from other politicians, Republican politicians, was his moderate positions on, for example, social welfare programs like Social Security and Medicare, which he said he wouldn't touch, and his kind of anti-trade platform, right? And I think that this goes hand in hand with immigration. So in the 90s, NAFTA basically led to globalization and the offshoring of many jobs in the United States, which disproportionately negatively impacted working class folks, right? And so we see in the 2024 election, both walls and his counterpart, Vance, kind of lamenting free trade, right? And so the parties have converged on this issue as the median voter has kind of taken a more anti-free trade position. Same thing with immigration. Republicans see this as a great opportunity for them to kind of attract voters, and Democrats see this as a weakness. And so what do we see? We see them kind of tacking to the middle with respect to immigration. They're trying to make this less of a pain point for them. Kamala just went to the border. Walz is talking about the need to secure the border with more border patrol agents. And I think that this is significant. The last thing that I want to discuss is the diploma divide. And this is kind of, I think, a really thorny question, because basically some people say people go to college and they get indoctrinated with liberal left views. And then other people say, and this is what's causing the way that these people were voting. But others say that when you go to college, you learn something. You are exposed to alternative viewpoints. You're exposed to new information, new theories of the world, new concepts, things like that. And so what's driving this diploma divide, I think, depends on how you view what happens in college. And I think that it's particularly stark that we see this diploma divide, particularly in elections with respect to Trump. Trump has been someone who has been capable of attracting these traditionally Democratic voters who are low education, who don't have college degrees. And his rhetoric is if you kind of test how his rhetoric is through different scoring mechanisms, it's at about a 6th grade level. He's talking in a way that's simple, that makes sense to people, and he's talking about the issues that matter to them. Conversely, Democrats, in their effort to try to expand their coalition, have been really targeting suburban voters who are disproportionately college educated. And so in that effort, they have developed a political strategy, a rhetoric, and a policy platform that is targeted basically to college graduates. And you see this with respect to Joe Biden's debt relief plan, right? And so I think that to tie this all the way back to Downs, every election, if a party has lost an election, you might expect them to alter their policy platform, right? To alter the things that they stand for. Now, we see a lot of continuity, but we do see significant change, and that's also important to recognize. And so the reason that we see these 50-50 splits is because the parties are doing their job, right? They're trying to attract new voters to get the median voter, and they're doing a remarkably good job of distinguishing themselves from the other party, while at the same time presenting themselves as someone who is appealing to the median voter.
Fantastic. That is so helpful. Thank you, Chandler. Yeah, there's so many things I want to get to. I hope we have time for everything because we've got lots of great threads to explore. We have a question, speaking of kind of rhetoric, we've talked a bit about immigration, a question here from a KLCC reporter about what sort of rhetoric there is around linking drugs and crime problems, especially around fentanyl, with immigration. So this is just some of the rhetoric that's been mentioned on the presidential campaign, but also locally. I wonder if one of you could talk a bit about that type of rhetoric with regard to drugs, immigration, and its potential impact in some of the down ballot races. Not sure if that's too specific for any of you to take on, or maybe is there anything you want to say more broadly about, I think, just fentanyl, huge issue. And we've seen, I think this has come up in the debates to various degrees. It's talked about a lot at these campaign rallies and often linked with immigration. But anything you want to say about just sort of how the candidates are talking about immigration, trying to address the issue that, Chandler mentioned about where the median voter might be on this question of immigration at the moment?
Well, I think if I can just add a little bit on the first point, I think linking drug use to racial minorities, as some of you likely know, has been a strategy that's been used by, you could argue, both the left and the right, but it's been prominent on the right since, I would argue, since the 1960s. I'm reviewing a book about Nelson Rockefeller, who was a moderate Republican coming out of the 50s and 60s, and was a racial liberal, and he found himself sort of falling back in his party. And what's one of the strategies that he uses to try and resuscitate his career, attacking right, not on civil rights specifically, but on, for example, drug use, crime, these issues that have long held racial undertones. So I would point to the prominence of this trend today with linking it to immigration as a continuation of a theme that's been present in rhetoric and public opinion in the US for decades.
Allison? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, one thing that's sort of a constant is, one party trying to argue that the problems that we're seeing in the world are a function of individual behaviors, and then another party making an argument that the problems that we're seeing are a function of sort of structural inequalities, structural biases, structural inefficiencies. And I think the drug issue, or this sort of drug narrative, is a great vehicle for, responding, especially on the Republican side, to sort of responding to the sort of epic, or the epidemic of houselessness, of unhoused individuals, of the sort of lack of available housing, and the Democratic Party down ballot, really trying to figure out how to deal with that in a structural way, holding space for the challenges that unhoused communities face, and really trying to find ways that are productive, right? To find spaces for folks to live safely and with integrity. And then you've got, the sort of call and response on the other side, which is, fundamentally about, right, these are sort of individual level problems, right? This is about drug abuse. This is about mental illness. This is about, criminal tendencies. And so it's not a new narrative. That's a sort of tried and true narrative, right? We see it in the context of welfare politics. We see it in the context of immigration. But I do think it's another effective way for voters, especially when they're looking at this housing problem, right? And we're experiencing this everywhere, but it's also especially an urban problem. It's a really effective way for one party to say that this is about liberal policies run amok, right? That we've allowed for the loosening restrictions on drug use, on penalties for drug use, and it's created, right, this epidemic of drug use that we're now seeing spilling over into our urban centers, into our streets, as a way of avoiding, right, this other question about, right, systemic housing inaccessibility and inequality and structural biases more broadly.
Whitney, did you want to comment on this as well, real quick?
Oh, just really quick, I was going to say that, yes, a lot of the rhetoric, kind of piggybacking off of that point as well, a lot of the rhetoric that's sort of anti-immigrant or talking about the dangers brought in by immigrants or liberal policies or whatever, the flip side of that, it's framed in a very negative way, but it implies it is referring to the family, utilizing the family as the sort of beacon for what it is that we are trying to protect and what is threatening it. And so it's not just effective at the most immediate level of scaring people, but it also is effective at the level of pointing to the things that need protecting, even if those things are sort of false traditionalist perspectives on sort of what a real American is or what a real family is, but that the negative and the positive rhetorical strategies kind of work together, even if they're not being spoken simultaneously, one refers to the other.
Great. We have a question here. Well, first of all, let me just mention, if we don't get to, questions are coming in. If we don't get to all of them, feel free to reach out to any or all of us on the panel to follow up further. We'd be happy to do so. There's a question here that I think this might be for Neil, but Claire Rush from the AP is wondering, Oregon's 5th congressional district is home to one of the most competitive U.S. House races in the country and one of just a dozen GOP toss-ups. Why do you think that is? What dynamics are at play in the district? And are you seeing any differences in this race compared to the 2022 midterms, in which Republicans flipped the seat red for the first time in 25 years? I'm not sure if that's too specific for you, Neil, or if you want to take a crack at that.
Yeah, I think Chandler, not to put him on the spot, has been following these
Okay.
rankings very closely. But one
Okay,
thing
great.
for folks outside of Oregon is the Oregon's fifth got redistricted in a pretty fundamental way, so that in 22, only about half the district that was in the fifth in 22 was the fifth district in the preceding decade. And so you have parts of Bend and then Eastern Oregon that make it very, very competitive. And it was a close race where both, depending on how you look at it, maybe both candidates did try and move more to the middle and in this Downsian sense that Chandler emphasized earlier. But I don't know if others want to add to that.
I'll say something very brief, and that is in 2020, this district didn't exist in 2020, but had it existed, it would have voted for Biden. In midterms, traditionally presidents lose votes, right? They lose support. And so what Neil referred to of like the impressive Democratic election in the 22 midterms, that was, they still lost the House. Like it was just, they performed much better than they would have expected, given that they had a president in power. And so I suspect that this race might flip. I don't think that I think it's possible, but it's unclear. But I think that the dynamics of the race, given that it's a general election, kind of provide a different structure for the kind of the play out of this particular race.
Great. Next question here I have for you. It's actually maybe I don't know if it's a two-part question, or at least it's let's see how this goes. So I think one of the things that has been talked about for 2024 is the expectation that it would be that AI facilitated deepfakes would have a big role to play, or at least artificial intelligence in some fashion would be a big feature, number one. I think number two, a question about celebrities and influencers. I mean, certainly celebrities have been part of politics for decades, but the role of influencers in society is greater than ever. You saw that at the Democratic National Convention, where they prioritized content creators, and they very much wanted them part of that experience. And so I just wonder if these are not necessarily related phenomena, but I think they're sort of new entrants into politics to a degree we haven't seen previously. Maybe just the role of content creators and influencers, as well as the role of AI. I wonder if any of you would like to touch on either or both of those things. Yeah, Whitney.
Yeah, I can jump in and talk a little bit about the AI question and the concern about deepfakes, which also existed in 2020, but was maybe, I mean, it's certainly people are talking more about AI stuff now than they were 4 years ago. But one of the things that I encounter quite a lot when I talk about issues related to mis and disinformation and conspiracy theories and falsehoods, a big question that a lot of folks, especially journalists, have for me is, and just generally across the board, but I get asked this question a lot, sort of what role should social media platforms play in highlighting when content is generated by AI? And it reminds me a lot of the same discourses that unfolded heading into 2020 with questions about disinformation labels. So back in the day when Twitter was still Twitter, there was a rollout of, both Facebook and Twitter would flag things if they're fact checkers, and they were working with third-party fact checkers, but that was sort of when a claim was contested, it was indicated as such on the platform itself. And so then the question then was, number one, is this good? And the expectation was that those labels were going to help people wade through the BS so that they could get true information. And then with true information, they can make better voting choices and just better sharing choices generally. And one of the things that you saw in 24, and which you're seeing again in 2024, but in the context of AI, is that for one thing, people don't always share things because they actually think it's true. It lines up with identity in other kinds of ways. Or if they're mistrustful of the organization or institution that is flagging something as suspect, having a disputed tweet kind of label could actually be potentially a kind of breadcrumb for, well, what are they trying to hide from us? And so with disinformation more broadly, it really depends on how the person, what they believe about the information communicator, whether it's a journalist or a platform. And so with AI, this question of, well, should these platforms have a policy where they indicate when something is AI generated? I could see a good argument as to why that would be helpful, but I also don't know if the people who might need those fact checks most could be who would actually benefit from it. That number one, they might not trust the platforms to tell them honestly. Maybe they have a different attitude now that Elon is in charge of X. But so it may be that they don't trust the platform itself, or it could be that people share false things because they know they're false. And that's not the point. The truth is not the point. Whether it's AI generated or not isn't the point. That isn't why people always do what they do in a fact-based sort of rational way that we might expect or hope. So just as interesting for me that those same conversations, the same question marks, and the same limitations of sort of pushing back against potentially false or harmful information, the technologies have gotten smarter, faster, scarier, probably, arguably, but we're still having the same conversations about them. And for me, at least, I still feel a lot of the same question marks I have from the very beginning of time.
So
Thanks,
the
Whitney.
deepfake thing, it gets a lot of attention, right? And the role of potential misinformation in our discourse. But I wanna kind of suggest that that's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to artificial intelligence and this emerging industry. It's going to fundamentally reshape our economy and our society. I would liken it to the internet. And we will see over the next 5 years, the technology companies, venture capital firms, they're investing billions and billions of dollars in kind of developing this technology, supporting people who work on it. And it will affect not only what things the campaigns put out, but how the campaigns operate. It will inform who has billions of dollars to spend on campaigns. It will shape how people consume information themselves. And so the deepfake thing is just one little piece of the artificial intelligence boom, which I think will totally upend our politics for years to come. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I was at the Democratic National Convention and Lil Jon came out and it was really interesting. And all these celebrities were pouring in, Kerry Washington, John Legend, Stevie Wonder. And I think it's easy to kind of characterize these people as individuals. They're known by one name or their names, but I started to recognize or realize that these people are a part of a broader industry. Hollywood, quote unquote, Hollywood is big business in the United States. It's our number one export. Hollywood films are one of our biggest exports. And so I think that Hollywood sees their future more tied up with the Democrats, right? And so the fact that they're supporting the Democratic Party is not surprising. And I think that it's one of the skills that they bring to the table is their network, right? The people that are willing to listen to them, that pay attention to them. And so Republicans have, if we want to just kind of characterize it grossly, they have big business, big oil, right? Trump said, give me $1 billion to run my campaign and I'll give you whatever you want. The same thing goes with, so he's got the support of kind of big energy, and Kamala has the support of Hollywood. And I think that might be a more effective way to think about how celebrity, Hollywood, can influence politics, but also protect its interests.
Thanks. Great. Allison?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example in this election of I think both parts of the question you're asking is the false endorsement of Trump by Taylor Swift, and then ultimately the actual endorsement of Kamala Harris by Taylor Swift. And the effects that had, in particular on, folks flooding registration pages, right, to check out what it required for folks to register to vote. And so, I think certain kinds of celebrity can certainly have a huge effect, especially when you're talking about, celebrities like Taylor Swift, right, who's created a phenomenon really of these Swifties who sort of just go wherever she sort of deploys them. which, again, is another sort of big question mark about the election. But, I do think the thing about AI, and the connectivity back to misinformation, or how information is provided, consumed, and ultimately deployed in the context of elections is a big one, because, I think at no point in history has lying not been a central part of elections, right? I mean, this is just what people do, right? Right? Politicians tell people what they want to hear in order to get elected. Truth is sort of a secondary, or even lesser important element of those particular narratives. And the role of the media, right, and sort of providing information in that space was ostensibly to be able to hold politicians accountable to some form of the truth. And now that we've seen this sort of explosion of media spaces through social media, right, where we don't have tried and trusted guardians of information to be able to captain the ship of how that information is disseminated, and whether there's any quality control. Now we have an abundance of information, but we have no idea which information is true or false, or AI generated, or generated by a human, or what to make of it, right? And so the sort of relationship of information to the natural compunction of candidates to sort of say what they need to say in order to get elected, lie or truth, regardless. I think we're in really murky waters, right? I think, as Chandler suggested, we're just at the very tip of the iceberg in terms of seeing what that big picture looks like for elections in the future.
Thanks, Allison. Well, we have just a couple minutes, and I know Neil needs to get off shortly, but maybe one final question to bring us home, and this can again be for all the panelists if you'd like to weigh in. Just very briefly here, regardless of the outcome of the election, what do you expect the post-election environment will look like? Obviously, taking into account the caveats that Chandler just mentioned about the difficulty of predicting any sort of future. But as you sort of imagine what might happen, particularly for the party that loses the White House or that loses the election, what do you see as some potential implications going forward for those parties, or just sort of for the general the environment of media and politics that we've been talking about?
I'll start us off. I think if Trump loses, he will be totally discredited, and he will be held responsible for losing the 2020 election, the 2022 election, and the 2024 election. And that might alter the way that the Republican Party conceives itself, right? If they come to recognize Trumpism as a losing strategy nationally, then I think that they will have no recourse but to change direction in terms of what they ought to do to win that median voter. If Trump wins, well, I think it will reify, it will create or justify or make sense of his particular approach to politics, and it will give it a legitimacy that it didn't have after he won in 2016. In 2016, it seemed maybe like a fluke or just this kind of weird election, but his continuing resiliency in our politics has suggested that there is enduring appeal to the Trump thing, to the Trump pitch. And so if he wins, I think that we will see a politics that is fundamentally different than the politics that came before Trump. And that will be the new standard. I think that will be the case.
Thanks, Chandler. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
I'm really, I mean, so that I think that's a really interesting way of looking at what might happen. The thing I'm looking for, and the thing I'm not sure about is, I think that you're right, Chandler, that if Trump loses and then the Republican Party, the institutional party, concedes that he lost, then that's going to really give a blow to Trumpism. But I just wonder how many and to what extent the institutional party, sort of the machinery, would be willing to admit a loss. So like it would require them to admit that they lost first and foremost. And you already see so much of the same groundwork that they laid before 2020 happening now. They don't control the mechanisms of power. So it will be different than what 2020 looked like if Trump loses. But it really is that question of will Trump's closest allies concede a loss if he does in fact lose? And I personally, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if they will, just based on all of the sort of groundwork that's being laid. But that is the big question of what happens if he loses. I think there will be chaos if he loses, more chaos than if he wins. Big things will change significantly in the United States if he wins. But if he loses, there's going to be a different kind of chaos. And I don't know what direction that's going to break in.
Thanks, Whitney. Allison or Neil, any final thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this forum today. This has been a lot of fun and really interesting. And I know I have lots of things that I want to explore further, but we appreciate you joining us for this University of Oregon forum on the 2024 election. If you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to any of our panelists today, and have a wonderful day. Thanks again.